I was talking to somebody the other day about brainwashing and when it's okay. It's really a lot more common in society than people realize. Is it ever okay? Even when the military does it? What is influence? Do I influence people the same as a cult does? And what about advertisements? Isn't that influence? How is the way cults influence people different from standard advertising? Let's examine those questions. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about what brainwashing is and how it's different from mind control. The two terms are thrown around a lot, and they're commonly used interchangeably. Are they different? The term brainwashing originally came from Maoist China. The word they used was Zi Now. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it literally means wash brain. It described a phenomenon where people would go in as lifelong America-loving, communism-hating patriots, and they'd come out as sympathetic to China and or communism, within a pretty short span of time, months or even weeks sometimes. How did that happen? The short answer to how that kind of thing works involves the quote-unquote brainwashers taking advantage of some basic psychology, like taking advantage of the phenomenon known as Stockholm Syndrome, and mixing that in with coercion, sometimes by force, making them see it from their captor's perspective. Small, logical steps mixed in with threats, followed by sympathy, followed by more threats. It's kind of the whole good cop, bad cop thing. Form a trust relationship, and then take advantage of that trust relationship. Nowadays, brainwashing isn't really used to describe what happens in cults. The term we use now is mind control. It's basically a longer, more drawn-out version of brainwashing. Subtle control techniques used on people. But the key to everything is establishing that trust relationship with somebody, getting them to sympathize with your cause and with you personally, and then taking advantage of that sympathy. Making them more malleable by getting them to follow directions, even if those directions are completely pointless. The idea behind it is making them more willing to listen to and obey you. If you're looking for a solid, straightforward example of brainwashing versus mind control, take the US military. They use brainwashing techniques in boot camp. As I said, it's kind of an accelerated version of what cults do with mind control. Now, don't take this as me trashing the US military. That's not my goal here. I'm just using it as an example. Their stated goal is to break you down and build you back up in their image. They do certain things designed to assert their authority over you. They want somebody who's going to follow orders without asking questions. They want somebody who would die for them without asking questions. By definition, what the military does is brainwashing and mind control, just like a cult does. Now, we can discuss the ethics of it. For example, with a cult, you don't really know what you're getting into. With the military, you sign up for a certain number of years, in and out. So maybe the US military is a little bit more ethical than cults like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormonism, in that respect. But if you compare it to the BITE model, the model we use to determine if something is a cult or not, it pretty much hits every marker all the way down. So that raises the question, is what the military does to people ethical? Who knows? It isn't really my place to speak to it. And as I said, don't take this as me trashing the military. I appreciate the fact that they're there, and I don't have to seriously stay awake at night worrying if the US is going to be invaded by another country. I don't have to wonder if I'll wake up in the morning to find out that the US is now part of North Korea or something. So take that for what you will. I'm glad for that fact. I'm just trying to examine and illustrate different methods of control, and the US military is well known for their control methods. So what is influence? There are a bunch of different forms of influence, and actually, Stephen Hassan has talked about this before. Obviously, we're influenced constantly by advertisements, and even people around us. Let me give you a for instance here. Let's say I want to go out to eat with a friend of mine. They don't really feel like it, but they reluctantly agree. And after you eat, you reveal to them that you left your wallet at home, so they have to pay for the whole thing. They wouldn't have gone if they knew that they had to pay for both of you. That's a very simple example of something called undue influence. They entered into a situation without fully understanding the consequences of their actions. Undue influence is another method of breaking somebody down. It's really common in cults. Once you break down one barrier, the next one is a lot easier to break too. And the goal through all of it is to make the person more malleable, more susceptible to control. You just have to be careful how much you use undue influence because you don't want them to see the consequences too early on. They'll feel betrayed, and it's all over from there. Another key to controlling people is to never let up on the control. Find different ways in their everyday life to control them. My mom was in the Air Force years and years ago, before she was a Jehovah's Witness. She told me they ordered her to only ever use 2 squares of toilet paper. Why? Sure, there's the obvious reason of conservation, trying to prevent waste. But it was really just a method of control. When nobody else was around, are you gonna do what they say? Even when nobody's watching. If you're gonna control somebody, you have to be able to justify it to them before they'll do it. At least early on. That'll be the basis for them justifying it to themselves later. Why only use 2 squares of toilet paper? To avoid waste. That seems like such a small, simple, logical thing. And that's how it starts. Small, simple, straightforward methods of control. Then take baby steps until they're willing to risk death by not getting a serious and necessary medical procedure like a blood transfusion, in Jehovah's Witnesses' case. It seems like a dramatic leap to us right now, but if you looked at the logical, small steps that it took to lead up to that, it would make perfect sense. And it does, to millions of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think that most of these cults realize what they're doing. Like Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't think they're setting out to manipulate or control people. I just think it comes naturally. You find this kind of thing in every cult, to one degree or another. Methods of control. And usually, the methods of control are used to condition in a Pavlovian way to alter the personality of the victim. For example, take a look at some of the control methods of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm touching on them a lot because that's where I came from. I'm an ex-Jehovah's Witness. So what are some of their most common methods of control? First and foremost, they restrict or control sexuality. That's a big one. They also discourage people from having friends on the outside of the group, which makes them more dependent on the group. It's their entire social network. They also promote dependence and obedience by discouraging people from going to college. Not only is that a form of control, but it makes them more dependent on the group, and thus makes it harder to leave if they ever chose to. Because the moment they leave, the members will all shun you. Friends and family. So you have no option but to stay. And if you're helping the church in some way by, for example, donating your time or money, or helping them set up their sound equipment, or whatever other thing, they all refer to that stuff as privileges. It's a privilege to help God's people. It isn't a religion, it's a way of life. To the fullest extent. Major life decisions have to go through them, like marriages, divorces, or separations. All that stuff has to be approved and conducted by the church. They also want you to spy and report on other people's misconduct. Not only does that reinforce control by pressuring people not to do anything the group wouldn't like, but it also acts as a reward system for people who do report on others. They feel exalted, they feel special, they feel holy, appreciated. Being better than other people gives them an endorphin rush. So what about me? Aren't I just using influence to move people away from this kind of thing? How am I any different than a cult leader by getting people to recognize that they're in a cult? Influence comes in a few different forms. There's a chart that's used, and I think it's even written by Stephen Hassan, the author of lots of the models we use to describe cults. It's called the influence continuum. Influence typically comes from 3 different directions. It can apply to organizations like governments or churches, to leaders like commanding officers, teachers, parents, or pastors, or it can be directed toward individuals. And there are 2 different types of influence on the influence continuum. There's constructive influence and there's destructive influence. To answer the question from the title of the video, when is it okay to brainwash somebody? The answer is never. However, there are times when it's okay to influence people. If you're exerting constructive influence, then you're in good shape. But listen to some of these forms of influence and think about whether or not there's anybody in your life that's using some of these methods on you, or on anybody you know. A boyfriend, a parent, a pastor, a teacher, a boss, or even on an organizational level, a religion or a company. On an individual level, constructive influence would include encouraging you to be who you are. Be your authentic self, versus trying to change your personality. An individual will love you no matter what, versus applying conditions to it. If you don't follow this set of rules, then you'll pay the price, like Jehovah's Witnesses. If you break this set of rules, then you'll be shunned. But it's for your own good, of course. It's always done for the person's own good, quote unquote. If they're exerting constructive influence, they'll encourage you to follow your conscience instead of their own doctrine. Jehovah's Witnesses will try to mold your conscience into something that reflects their doctrine. Constructive influence will encourage creativity and humor instead of fear and guilt. They'll try to encourage free will and critical thinking rather than dependency and obedience. Unhealthy or destructive influence for leadership includes encouraging narcissism and psychopathy. It'll encourage an elitist or grandiose attitude over knowing your own limits. It'll be power hungry rather than striving to empower others. It'll be secretive, deceptive, and claim absolute authority instead of being trustworthy and accountable. Recently, I went to the Jehovah's Jehovah's Witness headquarters to check the place out. I entered the whole thing like I was just another dude who had heard about Jehovah's Witnesses and was curious. But there were security cameras everywhere, and they were extremely guarded. They didn't want us to see anything from the inside. At one point they even said, "It's not that we have anything to hide, it's just that people come here and they have their own things in mind." They wanted us to wait at the guard gate for a minute and wouldn't tell us why. I continued to ask, and the only answer I got back was, "It's possible we might still let you tour the place. Why don't you just hang out and wait a little longer?" They were secretive and deceptive. It was eerie. They have this thing called Theocratic Warfare, where they're willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate people if it's in service to their parent organization. You're allowed to violate any biblical command as long as you're furthering God's goals. And of course, when they say God, they mean their parent organization. They're usually used interchangeably, which goes back to a lack of accountability. God can never be questioned, and they speak for God. Thus, they can never be questioned. Their membership is heavily controlled in ways you'd never expect, so they're very unlikely to question them in the first place. But if they do, there are consequences. Your friends and family will never talk to you again until the day you die. So far, that's been a sufficient deterrent. But it won't last forever, and in fact, they're hemorrhaging people right now, so it's only a matter of time before the control slips through their fingers, to quote Princess Leia. Here's some examples of destructive and constructive influence on an organizational level. With churches, for example, an authoritarian structure instead of one with checks and balances is destructive, deceptive, and manipulative instead of giving informed consent. I was around 13 when I was baptized. Baptism in Jehovah's Witnesses is no small thing. If you get baptized, from that moment on, if you break a rule, your friends and family will shun you. They might do it anyways if you don't follow along, but it's pretty much a guarantee if you're baptized. There are lifelong consequences for not allowing this organization to exert control over you. And in recent years, they've been pushing for kids to get baptized earlier and earlier. I've heard stories of kids getting baptized at 7 or 8. That is not informed consent. The goal is to trap them in before they know any better, before they can possibly be completely informed about the decision they're making. Be deceptive and manipulative, whatever it takes to bring them in and force control on them. Another destructive form of influence from organizations is when they attempt to create clones of people instead of encouraging individuality and diversity. You hear Jehovah's Witnesses talk about the new personality all the time. In fact, I made a video about it recently. It's all about forcing people into a mold through control and Pavlovian conditioning. If you see any of this coming from a church, a family member, a boyfriend, a teacher, a pastor, anybody, you should have red flags flying all over the place. If the organization has an ends justify the means mentality rather than a means create the end mentality, then it should be a serious red flag. Back to the Theocratic Warfare thing. Any action is justified in the name of protecting the organization. Lie, cheat, steal, manipulate, whatever it takes. It's in the name of quote-unquote good. So do what it takes to destroy those who are trying to hold the organization, aka God, accountable. An organization that's exerting destructive influence will want to preserve its own power rather than encouraging growth. Jehovah's Witnesses could bring in so many more members if they got rid of their shunning policy, and if they allowed their members to have friends that aren't in the religion. First of all, they'd look a lot less like a cult. But think about why they encourage shunning. Obviously, it would encourage growth if they opened it up and stopped. They shun because it's another method of control. The final consequence for breaking the rules. A deterrent to people who might want to leave, and it gets people fully invested in the religion. In with both feet. There's no fence sitting in this religion. The final example of constructive influence is people are free to leave if they wish. The destructive counter to that is believing that there are no legitimate reasons to leave. Now, setting aside all the stuff I mentioned a minute ago, there are also human rights violations in forcing somebody to remain in an organization. Specifically, Articles 18 and 20 of the Declaration of Human Rights. Here's Article 18. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Did you notice that bit at the beginning? Including freedom to change his religion or belief. And here's Article 20. Everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and no one may be compelled to belong to an association. Jehovah's Witnesses are obviously violating those two articles. They compel people to be members of the organization by trapping them early and imposing life-changing consequences for people who leave, preventing people from changing their minds. That's called destructive influence. But demonizing groups that criticize you is another method of control. The United Nations is viewed as the great beast of revelation by Jehovah's Witnesses. Anytime the UN is brought up, especially in this context, Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, demonize them. That means literally anything everything they say, even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is fruit from the poison tree. They've been saying the UN is the great beast for years, but they really lean into it anytime this is brought up. I guess the fact that it's the great beast just doesn't matter when they want to be members of the United Nations, which Jehovah's Witnesses were from 1991 to 2001, until it was exposed by The Guardian. They pulled right out of that and made up some nonsense about only being a member so they could have access to the UN library, when the same exact reading materials were available in book depositories within a few miles of the UN library. Don't even let me get started on the subject, because I'll never shut up. To sum up, if you're wondering when it's okay to brainwash, the answer is never. If you're wondering when it's okay to influence people, the answer is only when it's healthy influence. Encouraging free will, free expression, creativity, individuality, diversity, and personal growth. If somebody is using any of these tactics on you, then please do something about it. Keep a lookout for it. It doesn't have to come from a destructive cult, but it can. It can come from anybody. Boyfriends or girlfriends, teachers, parents, bosses, churches, organizations, governments, anybody. If you're in a situation where somebody is using these tactics on you, you should get out of it as soon as possible. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. I want to mention a few ways you can support me. YouTube is doing their own thing right now, like disfavoring independent content creators like myself and favoring mainstream companies. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC are seeing higher numbers on YouTube than ever right now, where independent content creators like myself are bending over and grabbing their ankles. So if there's a YouTuber you like and respect, and you want to give them some peace of mind to ensure they can survive and continue making content that they believe in, regardless of what YouTube does, consider supporting them. Not just me, but any content creators you like. You can watch ads, become members on YouTube, or become a YouTube Premium member, but honestly, I really prefer to disconnect my income from YouTube completely. That's why I use Patreon, and I have Teespring for t-shirts and stickers and stuff. Those are the two best ways. I also have some other ways of supporting me, which you can find on my website. Like, you can host your website through me, or you can check out my retro game store, things like that. You can also check out my podcast and my retro game YouTube channel, so keep it in mind. I am far beyond trusting YouTube at this point. All links are in the description, and as I said, you can find all the ways of supporting me on my website too, telltaleatheist.com. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.